What would make a group of men rise from the shadows, wreaking havoc across the land and shaking a region to its very core? What drives an outlaw brotherhood to strike with such ruthless force that the very soil beneath their boots trembles with fear? To understand the shocking brutality that tore through Brazil's back, we need to go back to a time when the lawless ruled the night and the cries of the oppressed could no longer be ignored. A time when a powerful landowner's men, armed to the teeth and loyal to their master, met their match in the hands of the legendary Cangaceiros, a brotherhood of outlaws who would change the course of history. But what was it that set them on this violent path? Was it desperation, rebellion, or something even more sinister? As the landowners' empire stretched its tendrils across the region, these outlaw forces, fueled by anger and revenge, fought not just for survival, but for a chance to break the chains of oppression. And yet, the question still echoes across time. What could drive them to such extremes? In the midst of Brazil's hidden past, where betrayal and vengeance intertwined like an unforgiving storm, one encounter would alter everything. The Cangaceiros would stop at nothing, and the powerful men who thought they controlled everything would soon realize they were not invincible. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may shock you. The story of what happened next isn't something you'll find in your typical history books. It's a tale of terror, raw power, and the brutal price of defiance. If you're already hooked, let me know your thoughts so far. Share in the comments below what you think led to this violent encounter. Was it fate or sheer force of will? And make sure to hit that like button if you're finding this story as gripping as I am. Don't forget to check if you're subscribed. There's more to come. The story of the Cangaceiros is not just about outlaws, it's about a people who had nothing left to lose. Imagine a world where the sun scorches the land, where the hills echo with the sounds of desperation, and where the rich grow fat off the suffering of the poor. This was the reality for many in the hinterlands of Brazil, where the landowners ruled with iron fists, their power enforced through fear, violence, and corruption. But in the shadows of this oppressive world, a new force was stirring. These were not just common bandits. The Cangaceiros were a brotherhood born out of the most desperate circumstances, their formation a response to an unforgiving society that had long abandoned them. The year was 1870. The poor were becoming tired of being crushed under the boots of the rich. Landowners, with their vast estates, controlled everything from the crops to the very lives of those who worked their land. They demanded unwavering loyalty, subjected their workers to cruelty, and crushed any form of resistance without hesitation. But even the most hardened of men can only endure so much. In the heart of Brazil's northeast, a man named Virgilino Ferreira da Silva, better known as Lampião, would rise to lead a group of rebels that would later come to be known as the Cangaceiros. Lampião was a man of few words but immeasurable violence. As a young boy, he had witnessed the murder of his father at the hands of a local police officer, an event that planted the seeds of his hatred for the landowners and the authorities that protected them. Lampião wasn't alone. In his pursuit of revenge, alongside him stood Maria Benita, his fearless companion and fellow outlaw. Together, they would become the faces of the Cangaceiros, inspiring countless others to join their ranks. But this wasn't just about robbery or survival. This was about sending a message. The Cangaceiros were here to show that the oppressed would no longer cower in fear. They would fight back, no matter the cost. The rise of the Cangaceiros wasn't a mere act of rebellion. It was a revolution, albeit one drenched in blood. The Cangaceiros weren't looking to take over or form a new government. They were warriors on a mission to exact justice, revenge, and terror against those who had long abused their power. They fought in a way that no one could predict, using hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and the treacherous terrain of the backlands to their advantage. Their ability to vanish into the unforgiving landscape made them nearly impossible to track, and the fear they instilled in their enemies was unmatched. But their rise wasn't without its challenges. The Brazilian government saw them as a threat to law and order, and soon the military was called in to stamp them out. Yet, the more they fought to destroy the Cangaceiros, the more their legend grew. The Cangaceiros had become a symbol of resistance, and its warriors, led by Lampion, were now feared and revered across the region. The question now was no longer whether the Cangaceiros would survive, it was whether they would succeed in their quest for vengeance, and what price they would ultimately pay for it. In the heart of Brazil's northeastern backlands, there was a man whose wealth and power were unquestionable. His name was known across the region, his influence reaching far beyond the boundaries of his estate. The landowner we speak of was no mere nobleman. He was a king in his own right, ruling over the lives of the poor and the powerless. His lands stretched across miles, dotted with plantations and cattle ranches, a sprawling empire that depended on the sweat and blood of those he oppressed. The people who worked for him had no choice but to obey. The law was a tool he controlled, and anyone who defied him met a brutal end. From the moment the sun rose over his land, he held the reins of power. His men, the armed guards and foremen, enforced his will with a violence that matched his own, punishing theft, disobedience, or even perceived disrespect with unimaginable cruelty. But what most people didn't understand was that this man, like so many others of his kind, was a product of the land he had inherited, a land built on slavery, inequality, and the unyielding submission of the weak. For generations, landowners like him had shaped the economy and culture of the controlling everything from the crops that fed the people to the lives of those who worked them. It was in this oppressive environment that the outlaws of the Cangaceiros would rise, and the landowner, once so powerful, was about to learn that his grip on the region could no longer keep the storm at bay. The landowner's methods were simple but effective. He relied on the fear he inspired in those around him. His men were notorious for their brutality, ensuring that anyone who even thought about defying him would be crushed before they had a chance to act. However, even in his powerful mansion, the landowner was never truly safe. A growing resentment festered among the local population, nurtured by the increasing violence and injustice that flowed from his estates. It wasn't long before word spread of the Cangaceiros' violent rise. The landowner, confident in his security, dismissed the rumors at first. He believed that his men, his guns, and his wealth would keep any uprising in check. After all, the landowner had the law on his side, the military, the police, and even the local government were all loyal to him. But this brotherhood of outlaws was something different. They weren't looking for a quick fight or a simple robbery. They were looking to send a message that would shake not just the landowner, but the entire region to its core. As the Cangaceiros grew bolder, striking fear into the hearts of those who once considered themselves untouchable, the landowner found himself facing something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. What had once been an isolated conflict in the backlands was about to become a full-fledged war, a war where the outlaws would stop at nothing to exact their revenge. The landowner had no way of knowing that his time was running out. Soon, the very men who worked for him would be fighting against him, and the empire he had worked so hard to build would begin to crumble, piece by piece. The tension had been building for months. The whispers of the Cangaceiros grew louder each day, and the landowner knew that it was no longer a matter of if, but when, the outlaws would strike. He had tried everything to protect his empire, increasing patrols, bribing local authorities, even offering rewards for information about the brotherhoods' whereabouts, but the Cangaceiros were like ghosts, slipping in and out of the backlands with such precision that even the most prepared forces couldn't catch them. Then, one morning, it happened. The sun had barely risen when the first shots rang out, echoing through the quiet morning air like a thunderclap. The landowners, guards, usually vigilant, were caught off guard. Their complacency shattered in an instant. The outlaws had come. They were eerie, and there would be no turning back. The Cangaceiros struck with the brutal efficiency that had made them infamous. They knew exactly where to hit. The landowner's estate, though vast and heavily fortified, was not invulnerable. The outlaws had studied every inch of it, and they had planned their assault meticulously. As the first wave of Cangaceiros moved through the landowner's grounds, they targeted key points: the stables, the armory, the overseer's quarters. The landowner's guards scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The outlaws were already inside, their guns blazing and their machetes swinging. The landowners, men, trained to uphold the system, found themselves powerless against the onslaught. It wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre. The Cangaceiros weren't fighting to conquer territory. They were fighting to send a message. With every guard they killed, with every building they torched, they were making it clear that the landowner's reign was over. No one was safe, not the men who worked for him, not the landowner himself. Amid the chaos, the landowner attempted to rally his men, but the fear had already taken root. The landowner, who had once stood as an unchallenged titan of the region, now found himself trapped in his own fortress, watching as his empire crumbled before his eyes. The Cangaceiros did not care for mercy. They moved through the estate like a whirlwind, leaving behind nothing but fire, blood, and destruction. But the true horror of the assault wasn't the violence itself, it was what came after. As the smoke from the burning buildings rose into the air, the Cangaceiros gathered their prisoners. The landowner's guards, now subdued, were lined up in front of their captors. But this was not an ordinary execution. The Cangaceiros didn't kill them quickly. Instead, they made their victims face the very thing that had defined their lives, their loyalty to a corrupt and brutal master. It was a slow and calculated punishment, one that would make sure the landowner's men understood the price of their allegiance. As the final moments of the assault unfolded, the landowner realized the brutal truth. This was no longer just a rebellion. This was a reckoning. And in the end, it would be the landowner's own hubris, his belief in his invincibility, that had led to the downfall of everything he had worked for. The Cangaceiros had sent their message, and the region would never be the same again. The violence of the Cangaceiros was not born from the thrill of bloodshed. It was born from pain, loss, and a burning desire for vengeance. The outlaws who formed the Brotherhood were not mere criminals seeking power or wealth. They were victims of a broken system, shaped by the brutal hands of the landowners, the police, and the government. But more than that, they were individuals who had been pushed to their breaking point, and the pain they had endured over the years manifested itself in the brutality of their actions. Lampião, the infamous leader of the Cangaceiros, understood better than anyone what it was like to lose everything. His father was murdered by a local police officer, and from that moment on, his life became one of rage and retaliation. But his story was far from unique. Many of the outlaws who joined the Brotherhood had similar tales of suffering, whether it was the murder of a family member, the oppression they endured as poor peasants, or the constant violence they faced at the hands of the rich and powerful. The Cangaceiros were united by one common thread, the need for justice in a form that no one else was willing to give them. It's important to understand the psychology behind their actions. The Cangaceiros did not see themselves as mere criminals. They saw themselves as warriors in a fight for survival. They fought not just against landowners and police officers, but against an entire system that had crushed their humanity. For them, every violent act was not just an act of retaliation. It was an assertion of their own worth in a world that had never given them the chance to prove it. They had been denied the right to live with dignity, and their violence became the only way they could regain that dignity. Revenge, however, is a double-edged sword. While it can provide a sense of temporary satisfaction, it often leaves scars that never fully heal. For the Cangaceiros, their pursuit of vengeance would eventually turn inward, feeding on their own souls. The more violence they committed, the more their humanity seemed to slip away. What began as a fight for justice gradually morphed into something darker, a cycle of violence that could not be broken. In their minds, they were justified. They were fighting for a cause that transcended personal gain. But in the eyes of the people they terrorized, they were nothing more than ruthless bandits. The brutality of the Cangaceiros was not just about revenge against their oppressors, it was also about survival in a world that had shown them no mercy. They had to be ruthless to ensure their own survival, and in doing so, they became trapped in a cycle of violence that would consume them. As the years passed and the Cangaceiros continued to grow, the outlaws became more than just a group of rebels. They became symbols of fear and even admiration for some, the very people they had fought against. The landowners and the elite began to see the Cangaceiros as a legitimate threat to their way of life. But at the same time, many of the poor peasants began to see them as protectors, warriors who fought not just for themselves, but for the powerless who had no voice in a world dominated by the rich and powerful. Yet, the true tragedy of the Cangaceiros story is that their pursuit of revenge, though it gave them power and respect, never brought them peace. In the end, their violence became their own undoing. They were not just fighting against the landowners. They were fighting against a system that had already crushed their spirits. And no matter how many battles they won, no matter how many men they killed, the cycle of revenge could never be fully satisfied. When the smoke from the Cangaceiros' attack finally cleared, the region was left in chaos. The landowners' empire, once seen as an unshakable force, had been shattered. The outlaws' assault was more than just a physical strike. It was a violent upheaval of the power dynamics that had long ruled the land. The landowners' grip on the region was slipping, and in its place, the outlaws were carving out a new reality, one where fear and uncertainty would reign. The first casualty of this upheaval was the landowner's reputation. Once considered the undisputed authority in the region, he was now seen as a symbol of weakness. His men, once loyal to the cause, were now questioning everything they had fought for. The loyalty that had bound them to the landowner was shattered in an instant, replaced by a deep sense of fear and confusion. What had been a clear-cut hierarchy of power now seemed uncertain, fragile, and on the verge of collapse. As the news of the attack spread, it became clear that the Cangaceiros had achieved more than just a tactical victory. They had sent a message that would reverberate across the region for years to come. The landowner, with all his wealth and power, was not invincible. His guards, his forces, and his influence had proven ineffective against the determined and brutal Cangaceiros, and the message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful, was safe as long as the Cangaceiros existed. But the aftermath wasn't just about the landowners' downfall. It was about what came next, the power vacuum that the Cangaceiros now occupied. With the landowner weakened, the Cangaceiros found themselves in a position to shape the future of the region. They became more than just outlaws. They were now a force to be reckoned with, and their presence began to alter the very structure of power itself. The local population, once terrified of the outlaws, now looked to them with a mix of fear and admiration. For many, the Cangaceiros represented hope, a chance for vengeance against the oppressive landowners who had controlled their lives for so long. But for others, they were a reminder that no one was ever truly safe. The fear that the Cangaceiros had instilled in the hearts of the elite now spread throughout the entire region, and every corner of the land seemed to tremble under the weight of this new reality. As the Cangaceiros moved through the region, their power grew. The landowners' former allies, once willing to do anything to protect the status quo, now found themselves facing an enemy they could no longer control. Some tried to fight back, but they were met with swift and brutal resistance. Others, seeing the writing on the wall, began to shift their loyalties, joining the Cangaceiros' cause or abandoning their landowner masters altogether. The military, which had once been called upon to protect the landowners and maintain order, now found itself struggling to maintain control. The Cangaceiros knew the land, the people, and the terrain better than anyone, and they used this knowledge to outmaneuver the authorities at every turn. The power that had once been held by the landowner was now slipping further away, and the military could do little to stop it. In the end, the Cangaceiros did more than just raid and pillage. They changed the very landscape of power in the region. They shook the foundations of the landowner system to its core, leaving behind a legacy of fear, uncertainty, and a new order that few could have anticipated. The region would never be the same, and neither would the people who lived through it. As the Cangaceiros spread through the backlands, the conflict between the outlaws and the landowners intensified. But this wasn't just a battle between the elite and the oppressed. The local community, made up of peasants, laborers, and small farmers, found themselves caught in the middle, forced to navigate the shifting tides of power. The landowners had long ruled through fear and coercion, but as the Cangaceiros began to assert their dominance, the community's loyalty was tested. For some, the Cangaceiros were seen as heroes, a symbol of resistance against the brutal oppression they had endured for generations. The outlaws were not just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the very people who had been crushed under the weight of the landowners' power. In many ways, the Cangaceiros represented a chance for the community to reclaim some semblance of control. As they moved through the region, the Cangaceiros offered protection to those who stood with them and exacted retribution on those who sided with the landowners. For many, this was the first time they had witnessed true power in their own hands. The violence that the Cangaceiros unleashed was not random. It was calculated, designed to send a message to the landowners and to those who aided them. However, not everyone in the community saw the Cangaceiros as liberators. Some, driven by fear or loyalty to the landowners, resisted the outlaws. For them, the Cangaceiros represented a new threat, one that was just as brutal and unpredictable as the system they had lived under for years. They feared the violence the outlaws brought and the disruption they caused to the established order. Yet, the reality was that the community could not afford to remain neutral. In a world where power was defined by violence, staying on the sidelines was no longer an option. Whether they supported the Cangaceiros or the landowners, the people were forced to choose sides, and that decision had dire consequences. The Cangaceiros knew this and used it to their advantage, playing the local population against the landowners in a way that no one could have anticipated. The landowners, too, understood the importance of the community's loyalty. They knew that if the peasants and workers turned against them, their grip on power would be lost. In response, they tried to maintain control through fear, increasing the brutality of their actions in an effort to subdue any resistance. But this only fueled the cycle of violence as the Cangaceiros retaliated with even greater force. The violence and rebellion became a vicious cycle with the community. Caught in the middle, the Cangaceiros strikes against the landowners were as much about terrorizing their supporters as they were about seeking revenge. The landowners, in turn, sought to crush any support for the outlaws, using their remaining power to break the spirit of the people. In the end, the true cost of the Cangaceiros was not just the lives lost on both sides, but the division it sowed within the community. Those who supported the Cangaceiros found themselves marked as rebels, outlaws, and enemies of the state. Those who sided with the landowners were branded as traitors and collaborators. The community, once bound together by shared hardship, was now fractured, each side bearing the scars of the violence that had erupted in their midst. The Cangaceiros were not just outlaws. They were masters of survival in an unforgiving world. To fight in the backlands of Brazil, where the sun scorched the earth and the law was nothing more than a whispered word, the Cangaceiros had to adapt, improvise, and think like a ghost in the night. Their survival depended on their ability to outwit, outlast, and outmaneuver not only the landowners but also the military forces sent to capture them. What made the Cangaceiros so dangerous was their mastery of guerrilla warfare. The outlaws did not engage in conventional battles where large armies clashed on open fields. Instead, they used the landscape itself as their weapon. The dry, rugged terrain of the Sertão, with its winding trails, dense forests, and rocky hills, was their home, and it offered them the perfect advantage in combat. The Cangaceiros knew the land better than anyone. They moved through it like shadows, striking swiftly and disappearing without a trace. Their tactics were as brutal as they were effective. The Cangaceiros would launch surprise attacks on unsuspecting targets, whether it was a landowner's estate or a military patrol. Armed with rifles, machetes, and explosives, they descended on their enemies with overwhelming force. But it wasn't just about violence, it was about psychological warfare. The Cangaceiros knew how to strike fear into their enemies, how to make them doubt their own strength and resolve. They used hit-and-run tactics to avoid direct confrontation, always keeping their enemies off balance. When they attacked, it was swift, brutal, and calculated. They would strike quickly, wreak havoc, and then vanish into the hills, where their pursuers could never follow. The Cangaceiros' ability to disappear into the vast wilderness made them nearly impossible to track, and their enemies often found themselves walking in circles, searching for shadows. But their survival wasn't just about evading capture. It was about maintaining their resources and strength. The Cangaceiros were self-sufficient, relying on the local community for food, shelter, and support. They were skilled in the ways of the land, hunting, foraging, and using their knowledge of the region to stay one step ahead of their enemies. They also relied on their fierce loyalty to one another, forming bonds that were unbreakable in the face of danger. Despite the odds stacked against them, the Cangaceiros were able to maintain their position for years. They knew how to strike fear into the hearts of the landowners and the military, but they also knew how to survive. They understood that in the world they lived in, staying alive was the ultimate victory. And to do so, they had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep adapting to the ever-changing threats around them. Their ability to fight and survive was not just a testament to their strength. It was a reflection of their will to endure, no matter the cost. For the Cangaceiros, every attack, every escape, and every victory was a step closer to avenging the wrongs that had been done to them. But as time passed, the constant violence began to take its toll, and the Cangaceiros were forced to reckon with the brutal reality of their existence. As the Cangacos' reign of terror stretched across the backlands of Brazil, the inevitable question began to emerge. How long could they keep running? The constant battles, the constant survival, the constant need for retaliation, all of it began to take a toll. What began as a rebellion fueled by rage and a desire for justice had transformed into a violent cycle that no one could break. The Cangaceiros had carved their names into the region's history, but as time wore on, their violent path started to crumble beneath the weight of its own legacy. The Brazilian government, alarmed by the growing threat of the Cangaco, began to deploy greater forces to crush the Brotherhood. The military, once overwhelmed and outwitted by the Cangaceiros' guerrilla tactics, began to adapt. They learned from their mistakes, and with the support of local authorities and the landowners, they began to hunt the Cangaceiros down with a single-minded determination. One by one, the leaders of the Cangacos were captured or killed. Lampião, the legendary leader of the Brotherhood, fought until his last breath, but even he could not escape the trap that had been set for him. His death marked the symbolic end of the Cangaco. As a movement, with his passing, the Brotherhood lost its heart, its soul. The Cangaceiros scattered, their once feared unity broken, and the fire that had driven them for so long began to burn out. But the death of Lampião and the fall of the Cangaco didn't mark the end of the violence or the resentment. The legacy of the Brotherhood remained in the hearts of the people, and the stories of their exploits would live on for generations. The Cangaco may have been defeated, but the scars they left on the land and the people would never fade. For many, the Outlaws were still seen as symbols of defiance against the oppressive forces of the landowners and the state. The landowners, who had once been so terrified of the Cangaceiros, could now rest easy, but they could never forget the price they had paid for their power. The region that had once been ruled by fear and violence would now fall under the control of the military and the state. But the people, who had long suffered under the weight of the landowners, would remember the Cangaco, not as a group of criminals, but as warriors who had fought for their right to live free. Even in their defeat, the Cangaceiros left behind a legacy that could not be erased. Their story became a part of the region's folklore, a tale of bloodshed, revenge, and resistance that would be told for generations. And while the Brotherhood itself may have fallen, the lessons of the Cangaco would continue to resonate in the hearts of those who still dreamed of a world where justice was something more than a fleeting illusion. The story of the Cangaco is not just a tale of violence, revenge, and rebellion. It is a story of resistance, one that goes beyond the bloodshed and terror to explore the depths of human struggle. It's a story of people who had been pushed to the brink, who faced a system that sought to crush their spirits and their hopes, but who refused to be silenced. The Cangaceiros, with all their brutality, were not just outlaws. They were warriors, driven by a desire for justice in a world that had never given them a chance. The end of the Cangaco may have been the closing of one chapter, but the echoes of their fight still reverberate through history. The Cangaceiros' defiance against the landowners, the military, and the very systems of oppression that ruled their lives is a legacy that remains. They may have been defeated in the end, but their story has lived on, inspiring generations who look back at their struggle as a symbol of resistance in the face of tyranny. As we close the book on the Cangaceiros, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned from their story? The lesson is not just about the inevitability of violence or the brutal reality of resistance, but about the power of the human spirit to fight against the forces that seek to oppress it. The Cangaceiros may have lost the battle, but their fight is far from forgotten. If this story has moved you, and if you've gained something from these dark chapters of Brazilian history, then consider subscribing to this channel. Let us continue uncovering the hidden stories of the past, the ones that have been silenced and forgotten. Stories that we must remember if we are ever to truly understand where we've come from. What do you think of the Cangaceiros? Was it a fight for freedom, or simply a brutal cycle of violence? Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and let's keep the conversation going. If you've made it this far, you're clearly interested in the stories that history tries to erase. So don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and click the next one that will take you deeper into the shadows of history. We've only just begun.